All right. So you know how sometimes it's like the words are right there in your head, but when it comes to actually like saying them out loud in English, feels like it feels like climbing a mountain.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's that mental block that a lot of English learners face, and it can be
Mhm.
really, really frustrating no matter what level you're at.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
So we're looking at this whole idea of like overthinking when you're speaking English and why that really holds you back. And more importantly, what we can actually do to kind of break free from that and just start speaking more naturally and more confidently. Right. We've got some super interesting stuff to dig into from both like the educational side of things and also how this actually plays out like, in real life situations.
That's right.
So our mission today is basically to like show you why all that internal chatter can actually be like a saboteur for your fluency and to really get into the psychology of why we hesitate when we speak. And then give you some really practical tools and some different ways to think about this whole thing that can really make a difference.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating when you start looking at how our minds are actually working when we're trying to speak, especially in a second language.
Yeah, and a lot of what we've been looking at talks about these two systems in the brain, and they're often called system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is like the fast, intuitive part of your brain, right? It just works automatically without you having to really put in a ton of effort.
Right.
Like when instantly recognize a song or you just know how to finish a common phrase, it's that kind of automatic processing.
Exactly. And then you have system 2, which is more deliberate and slower. It's a
Yeah.
part of your brain that you use when you're, solving a really complex problem or when you need to really focus your attention on something, making a conscious decision. It's the thinking part of your brain.
Right, like when you're really concentrating on something. And what's interesting is that a lot of the stuff we've been looking at highlights how when we're speaking English, we tend to switch to that system 2 mode, right? We start trying to like consciously build these perfect sentences in our heads, and we're focusing really hard on all the grammar rules, and we're searching for just the absolute best word, and it becomes this really step-by-step analytical process.
And if you think about it in the context of an actual conversation, right?
Oh, yeah.
Conversations happen in real time. They move quickly. There's not always time to do that deep dive into grammar before you need to respond. I think a lot of learners, maybe because of the way they've been taught languages, traditionally get into this habit of like meticulously constructing sentences before they actually speak, almost like you're writing an essay, which makes it really difficult to switch to that faster, more natural system 1 thinking.
Absolutely. And it really slows you down too, right? Like
Yeah.
your response time takes a hit because you're so caught up in that analysis that the conversation kind of moves on without you.
Yeah.
And it can also make you really doubt yourself too, right? Like you start questioning every single word, and that hesitation can just become this like vicious cycle. And what's funny is you're often so focused on getting the grammar perfect that you actually lose sight of why you're speaking in the first place, which is to actually just communicate your message.
Right. Yeah.
You miss out on opportunities to just engage in the conversation because you're so busy, analyzing everything in your head.
And that brings us to like a really important question. What's the alternative?
Mm.
And all the stuff we've been reading and watching points to this idea of moving away from that system 2 analytical thinking and trying to tap into that more instinctive system 1 when you're speaking.
Exactly. It's about shifting from like constructing every sentence so carefully to just kind of letting your natural understanding of the language flow out. And, one of the biggest takeaways from all of this is that you probably already have way more English vocabulary and knowledge than you think you do.
That's right.
Like all that time you spent studying and listening hasn't just vanished. It's all in there somewhere. You just need to find a better way to access it, without that analytical bottleneck slowing you down.
Yeah, it's like one of the sources we were looking at had this analogy about a toolbox, right? Like imagine you have this toolbox full of really useful tools, but you're so busy reading the instruction manual for every single tool that you never actually pick one up and start using it.
Yeah, I love that analogy. It's like you have all the resources, but something's stopping you from actually using them.
Exactly.
So we've talked about like why overthinking can be such a barrier to speaking fluently, but there's this huge emotional element too, right?
Yeah.
The fear of making mistakes like that can be paralyzing for people.
Oh, absolutely. And the material we've been going through really tries to reframe how we think about mistakes in language learning.
Yeah, and the sources are super clear on this. Mistakes are not failures. They're actually a really crucial part of making progress, you know?
Right.
Think about it. If you're not speaking at all, you're not going to make any mistakes, but you're also not learning or improving. So the goal at first isn't to have perfect grammar. It's more about building up your confidence in communicating, you know?
Yeah, like think about the classic example of how little kids learn their first language. They make tons of grammar mistakes. They like invent their own words. Their pronunciation can be all over the
Yeah,
place.
totally. Like they'll say things like, I go to the store yesterday, or can I have more juicy?
Exactly. And yet, despite all those so-called mistakes, they eventually become fluent speakers. And a big reason for that is that they're not afraid to get it wrong. They just speak,
Yeah.
and they learn from those experiences, and there's something really freeing about that approach, don't you think?
Totally. And that's the mindset shift we need to aim for. Like, our sources keep saying fluency actually comes from making those mistakes. It's all about trial and error.
Right.
Progress is way more important than this idea of being perfect right from the start. And ultimately, what really matters is being clear, you know, making sure your message gets across, not whether you use the perfect grammar every time.
So how do we actually move away from this analytical way of thinking
Yeah.
and toward a more action-oriented approach when we're speaking? All the stuff we've been looking at actually has some very practical suggestions for that.
Yeah, let's get into some specific techniques, because these are things you can literally start using today to help you speak more without getting stuck in your head.
Right.
One of the first ones that I really like is called the 3-second rule.
The 3-second rule. Okay.
Yeah, and it's so simple, but it can be really effective. So basically, whenever someone asks you a question in English, you try to start responding within 3 seconds, even if you don't have like the perfect answer completely formed in your mind yet.
Interesting. So do our sources mention any downsides to that? I'm thinking like, could that lead to more mistakes at first, and how should learners approach that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the sources do acknowledge that you might not get everything perfectly right every time, but the point is to just get something out there.
Yeah.
You know, it forces your brain to actually use the knowledge it already has and start speaking instead of freezing up while you try to construct the perfect response. It's all about prioritizing that immediate communication over perfect articulation.
I see.
And even if you make a little mistake, you're still participating in the conversation, you're keeping things flowing, and that's way more valuable in the long run.
Okay, I like that. Another technique that keeps coming up is using anchor phrases.
Yeah, these are great. It's like having some ready-made conversational tools that you can just pull out whenever you need them.
Right.
So if you memorize a few key phrases like, that's a great question, or let me think about that for a moment, or in my opinion, you know, things like that, it gives you a little bit of time to think without creating an awkward silence, you know?
It keeps the conversation moving smoothly, and it gives you a moment to collect your thoughts before you jump into your full answer.
Exactly. Okay, then we have free talk sessions. This is where you set a timer, like our sources recommend, around 2 minutes, and you just pick any random topic that pops into your head and you just talk out loud in English.
Okay.
And the really important rule here is no stopping, no correcting yourself. You just let the words come out however they come out.
Just get it out there.
Yeah, exactly. And the key here is consistency. If you do this every day, even if it's just for a couple of minutes, it can really help to build that automaticity in your speaking.
That makes sense.
Okay, next one, shadowing practice. Have you ever tried this one?
I have.
Okay, so for anyone who hasn't, this is where you listen to a native English speaker. This could be from a podcast, a news clip, a movie, anything, and you immediately repeat what they're saying, trying to match their rhythm, their tone, their speed, everything as closely as you can.
Yeah, it's amazing for pronunciation, intonation, and just your ability to process English and respond quickly. It's almost like you're training the muscles you use for speaking English to be faster and more accurate.
Yeah.
And you're doing it without having to consciously analyze the grammar. Your brain is just learning to process and produce the language more automatically.
Exactly, and it's fun too. Okay, and finally, we have story retelling. So after you watch a short video or read a paragraph, try to tell that story out loud in your own words. This is a great way to work on your memory recall in English and also to make your spoken English smoother and more natural.
So it seems like all these techniques are about shifting your learning from being mostly passive, where you're just taking in information, to being more active, where you're actually producing the language by speaking.
Exactly. And that leads perfectly into the next big thing, building consistent English speaking habits. Our sources really stress that if you want to stop overthinking when you speak, you basically need to retrain your brain to make speaking English a regular part of your daily routine.
Yeah, it's like building any habit, right? Whether it's exercising or playing an instrument. consistency is so much more important than like the intensity or how long you do it for in any single session.
Right.
Even short, regular bursts of speaking practice can have a huge impact over time.
Yeah, so our sources recommend trying to build a daily routine that includes some form of English output.
Okay.
This could be as simple as just talking to yourself in English throughout the day, describing what you're doing, what you're thinking, even just narrating your daily tasks in English.
Talking to yourself. That's a good one.
Oh.
Another one that I've found helpful is writing a short paragraph in English, maybe about my day or my plans, and then just practicing reading that out loud. It kind of helps connect your writing and speaking skills in a really practical way.
That's a good one. And remember, we talked about listening.
Yeah.
Instead of just passively listening to English audio, try to actively repeat phrases or even like mimic entire short conversations that you hear.
Oh, that's good.
And this might feel a little weird at first, but recording yourself speaking and then listening back to it can be super helpful.
Oh, yeah.
It can help you pinpoint areas where you might want to improve, and you can also track your progress over time.
Yeah.
And of course, nothing beats actually speaking with other people, right? So whether that's joining an online English conversation group or finding a language exchange partner, those are really valuable experiences.
The bottom line is to make an effort to shift from mostly consuming English through listening, reading, studying grammar, to actually producing it by speaking regularly.
Totally. Okay, so let's make this even more practical. How can you actually use all these techniques in like real life situations?
Okay.
Well, our sources have some great examples. So think about something as ordinary as ordering food at a restaurant, right?
Right.
Instead of getting all caught up in your head trying to construct the perfect complicated order, just keep it simple and direct, like, I'll have the chicken sandwich, please. Or when you're introducing yourself to someone new at an event, have a go-to phrase ready, like, hi, my name is blank, I'm from blank, and I work as blank.
Okay.
And if you practice that a few times beforehand, it'll feel way more natural when you actually say it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I know small talk can feel a little intimidating for some people,
It can be.
but it really doesn't have to be if you have a few simple opening questions that you can use, like, where are you from? What do you do? Or do you like this place? Those are all easy ways to start a conversation without overthinking it.
Yeah, and even practicing making phone calls can be helpful. There's some cool AI language learning apps out there that actually simulate phone conversations.
Oh, wow.
Or you could even just practice reading a script out loud as if you were on a call.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So the key takeaway here is that you are surrounded by opportunities to practice speaking English. You don't need a formal lesson or a special event. Just start looking for those everyday moments and use them as your practice ground.
That's a good point. We can't really talk about this without acknowledging the elephant in the room, though, right? The fear of speaking.
Oh, yeah, the fear is real.
I mean, this is a huge obstacle for a lot of learners.
Absolutely. And it's completely normal, that feeling of worrying about looking stupid or using the wrong word or not being understood. Those are incredibly common fears. You are definitely not alone if you feel that way.
Absolutely. And the good news is that the sources we've been digging into offer some really helpful mental tools to help overcome that fear. One of the most powerful ones is a simple mindset shift. Start viewing every time you speak as practice, not as a performance that has to be perfect.
Yes. It's not about delivering a flawless speech every time you open your mouth. It's just about getting more comfortable with using the language, experimenting with it, and learning as you go.
Right.
Think of it like going to the gym. You wouldn't expect to be able to lift the heaviest weights on your very first day. It takes consistent practice to build up that strength.
That's a great analogy.
And another key concept is that speaking a language is actually a form of muscle memory.
Muscle memory, huh?
Yeah, it's like learning to ride a bike.
Yeah.
You get better through repetition and consistent effort, not just by learning more grammar rules. You actually have to engage those muscles involved in speaking to develop real fluency.
I see.
And I really love this reframe that the sources talk about. Instead of focusing on, what if I make a mistake? Try asking yourself, what if I grow from this? That little shift in perspective can help you move away from fearing failure and toward embracing the learning opportunity that every speaking attempt offers.
I like that. And I think ultimately true fluency comes when you shift your focus away from being self-conscious, worrying too much about what others might think of your English, and toward actually expressing yourself and connecting with the people you're talking to.
Absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up, what's the big message we want you to take away from this deep dive into speaking confidence?
Well, it's that you probably already have a much stronger foundation in English.
Right.
Then you realize you don't need to learn a million new words or have perfect grammar to start speaking more confidently.
And you definitely don't need to wait for this magical moment where you suddenly feel completely ready.
Right? Because that might never come.
Exactly. The key is to just start taking action to prioritize speaking over just analyzing everything in your head.
So true.
Trust the knowledge you already have, trust your instincts with the language, and trust the learning process, even the little mistakes along the way.
Because every time you speak English, no matter how good or bad you think it is, you are getting closer to fluency.
So here's your final thought. Fluency doesn't wait for perfection. It actually begins with action.
So stop overthinking and start talking.
Exactly.
I love it.